sheffielddocfest.com, and the code is just on the screen. I believe they're coming online. Okay. Hi, Melissa. Hi, Ingrid. Can you hear us?
Yes,
I
we
can hear you.
Okay, brilliant. Thank you so much for being here today with us online, and thank you so much for sharing the film. I mean, it's a much needed film, and I hope more to come. Maybe I'll just start Yeah, go for it. Sorry, there's a delay. I'm like, I should pause. I think maybe we can start off just asking, how did you get involved with filming the family?
Well, first, before we dig in, and apologies for the delay, just thank you everyone for coming and seeing this. This is our world premiere. It's an incredible, incredible honor. Ingrid and I have wish we could be with you, but we'll do our best here. Thank you to Sheffield also for programming this film. It could not be a more important time for us to see this and to see it together. We can both talk a little bit about how we met the families and began working on this project together. I was doing some reporting in Columbus, Ohio about police killings. That's how I met the family of Donna Dalton. And that's how I also learned that in Columbus, no police officer had been indicted for murder for, at that point, nearly 20 years, until the officer who shot and killed Donna, Andrew Mitchell, was indicted for murder in 2019. But I knew that it wasn't just this family that was going through this. And there was actually this whole network of families, mostly led by Black women, mothers, grandmothers, also sisters, granddaughters, even, are part of this kind of intergenerational community of women who come together both to recognize their own grief together, but also to fight back against the city to try to get some answers. And so it was through that network that already existed in some ways that we got to meet all of the families of Henry Green, of Tyree King. And the way that we met, actually, the family of Julius Tate was unique. It was a family who hadn't really talked that much publicly about the death of Julius Tate, and I'll let Ingrid take it from there.
Yeah, thanks, Melissa. I got involved specifically because I used to live in Columbus, Ohio for some time, and I was connected with the local organizers on the ground who were doing a lot of work around police brutality, and that's where I learned what was happening in the city that I was living in. Countless deaths and murders that were going without justice by local police, and organizers really trying their hardest to make sure that people in the city knew about it. And so I was invited to document a protest that was for Tyree King, the 13-year-old boy who was shot by police, who we featured their family in. And in that way, I just learned about the families, their names. And so when Melissa and I connected together, Melissa was doing work as a journalist and writing on these stories. And I had been on the ground, documenting in a very low-key way, giving the photos over to organizers. And we were like, okay, well, I think this is time to join in our skills and our efforts to really make space for this story.
Great, thank you. I wondered then if you can just talk about the process of the ethics of making the film, and how you collaborated together as well.
Yeah, sure. Well, I think it was, when we reached out first, we were like, okay, let's make the story about families, particularly who had lost their loved ones. Melissa had a direct relationship to Bobby McCullough, who's the sister of Donna Dalton. And we wanted to also center the other families. And so while we didn't have direct relationships to them, we really heavily relied on the community at large. People who had worked endlessly to build avenues of trust and channels of trust that could essentially, one, vet us, right? Like, why are we here? Where are we from? What's our intention? And then relay that back to the families. For Adrian Hood, the first woman that's featured in the film, as well as the King family, the grandmother and mother of Tyree King, they knew each other. They were introduced to each other by way of a local organization called People's Justice Project, as well as them both sharing the same legal representation. And so for us, it was really important not to come in a way that's like extractive of what their stories were, but that was like they knew us through someone that they fully trusted. And we really listened to them. How do you want to tell your story? What do you want to say? Why is this important? And Melissa and I had a lot of pre-interviews, pre-conversations with folks to really sit down with them and just them welcoming us in. And then from there, telling their story the way that they thought, the media hadn't. And then we felt like that was kind of what the film was going to be about. How do we frame a different angle and perspective on what people know formally as like police murders and how they're being covered in media coverage? Melissa, would you like to add anything to that?
Yeah, it's a great point to jump in on. I think, even though for some of the families who told their stories before, either to local news, whether that's TV or newspapers, they didn't feel like that they had accurately represented their stories. And part of it is like the bandwidth of those kinds of news organizations, particularly in the US, where we have kind of a mass disinvestment in local media. They weren't going deep, and they certainly weren't in a position to respect the power of the families and the stories. I think a lot of times families get represented as, grieving mothers, grieving grandmothers, grieving sisters, but then to then also show the ways that they are fighting back and the ways that they've built community and resilience together is so often left out. So it was really important for us to show what that looked like in an organic way. And you see that even before we get to the end of the film, with the summer 2020 uprisings for George Floyd and Breonna Taylor, the families had been actively leading marches and rallies, pestering the district attorney's office, the mayor of the city, any sort of target in government. And it felt like to leave that out of the story would make them really one-dimensional. And I think the conversations I remember having with Ingrid before we started were really about this idea of, we aren't in a position to give anyone a voice. And I tell this to people that I interview who are sharing difficult or traumatic experiences with me. I'm not in a position as a journalist or a filmmaker to bring you justice. I don't have the power to do that. And if anything, I might expose you to things that you would rather not be exposed to. But knowing all of that and knowing that I'm going to walk with you in this, is this something you want to be a part of? And I just think being very, very honest and very upfront. In the case of these families, everyone had different sort of comfort levels with the media. And for them just to let us into their homes, which they were able to do, this is right before COVID. We finished shooting in February of last year. It was just a huge gift, particularly the families who we knew they were still in it, and this was maybe like the first time they'd really talked about these things with anyone outside their family.
Yeah, I can imagine. I think that kind of nicely kind of goes into my next question about your choice of filming architecture, as it becomes quite a central focal point of the film, and maybe you can talk about how your decisions on plotting that as a story arc.
Absolutely, yeah. We were really inspired by Brett Story's documentary, 12 Prisons in Landscape, and we just wanted to really center Columbus, Ohio as this like particular city in which that is a container for violence in the Midwest. And a lot of murders really just don't leave outside of these borders. And so it was very important for us to say, okay, this story is about these women in Columbus, Ohio. How do we represent Columbus, Ohio specifically? And so we spent quite a bit of time just like filming all around the city. And what we found was really interesting was like filming these buildings, which are really just kind of the containers of violence and also inaccountability, these almost like faceless agents of violence, that in the film you might sense a feel of like coldness to them, like you can't relate to it, it's a brick building, what am I supposed to feel? And that's what they are, right? They shelter a lot of the individuals that we hold accountable for the reasons why these families have not received justice. And so our way to do that was to show kind of these agents of violence, these antagonists, by showing buildings of the city. To know that in each of those windows, there's an office in which someone has a role and responsibility that they're not taking towards justice. Similarly to why we go into the women's homes, or whether we are out in the street, we wanted to show both this duality of like intimacy in someone's home and what safety looks like, but also what does safety look like in these buildings when it pertains to these police killings.
I'll just add something super briefly. To have the privilege to go back to Columbus in the summer of 2020, which Ingrid and our co-producer Rune Noor did, and as well as our cinematographer Ben Willis, who's based there, to be able to get out in the streets and film what was going on, and to bring that context to the film, to see these spaces that we had filmed in the winter when they were completely barren. There were no people in them. It was that cold sort of institutional face. Then see them filled up with people occupying those spaces, whether that was the courthouse or the grounds around the Christopher Columbus statue, which is no longer there. That felt like such a great sort of flip to what that cold institutional architecture means in the film.
Of course. Thank you. There's a question from the audience from Danny asking, have the Columbus police commented on your film or anyone you've met who represents them in any way?
I can take that because I've probably been the one who's been in most contact with the Columbus police going on now for almost 3 years. And I know the names of some of the PIOs, the public information officers there, and they're just very curt. They are not in a position, I think, to comment on the film. It was difficult enough getting information from them, just nuts and bolts information like, hey, what was the results of this internal affairs investigation to one of the officers? So no, we haven't heard anything directly from them about the film. I think that it's very difficult to get even the information we want out of them, let alone to sort of give them something proactively to respond to.
Yeah, of course.
Yeah, and in a weird way, not weird, but it actually mirrors, the families themselves and what they haven't heard from the police as well, right? The endless amount of questions that they have for the local police that the local police is just not giving any answers to.
Of course, yeah, definitely.
We made the choice too not to represent the police's perspective. You see that, right, when we have the police in the film in black and white, and they're literally muted. We have the family speaking over them. The police side of the story is out there and it's been out there, and we're not saying anything about the police that they haven't already put out in the public themselves. Yeah. So it felt like, especially in the space that we have, to open that up to the families and let them fill that space entirely was what we wanted to do.
Yeah, thank you for holding the ground. We appreciate that. Just last one, do you have any updates of any of the cases?
In August, so just in a couple of months, Andrew Mitchell, the officer who shot and killed Donna Dalton, his murder trial is going to begin in Columbus. As far as we know, our entire justice system has slowed down even more than usual because of COVID, and that case has been put back several times. So by the time his murder trial starts, it will have been just about 3 years exactly from the time that he shot and killed Donna. Some of the other families, because they didn't have that, there was a criminal trial. They sought other legal avenues, like trying to get settlements out of the city, or even, these civil cases where the city won't necessarily admit wrongdoing, but has to open up some information possibly about what happened. There are some of those ongoing for the Green family and for the King family, I believe.
Thank you so much. Ingrid, did you have anything else to say?
Yeah, just wanted to say that, our hope for this film is that folks see that even though, this is taking place in Columbus, Ohio, and that this film is done through an American lens, it has a very internationalist as also perspective on what justice could look like whenever violence is committed, when the agents of violence are not being held accountable to their actions and justice. And our hope is that, these families and the countless other families who are going through this can relate and start putting, these kinds of connections together, how the media and how the criminal justice system and how the city at large are all in kind of cohorts together, and how we can, maybe pose ourselves these larger questions of what does justice look like, and is it attainable, and how can we actively work to get there?
Yeah, I was gonna just final question around what do you think we can do collectively to get all the stories out, apart from obviously social media, which is already a movement in its own way, but even then we're being censored. So
for me, I think what's important is sort of who is telling the story and how it's being framed. So, for example, after the murder trial of Derek Chauvin, the Minneapolis police officer who shot and killed George Floyd, when that ended in a guilty verdict, like half hour later, we learned that Micaiah Bryant, a 16-year-old girl in Columbus, Ohio, was shot and killed by Columbus police. And, that just, the idea that these criminal trials, when they end in a guilty verdict, produce justice. I think we have to get outside of that framing and ask a much broader question, which is for people who are impacted by this, for these communities, what do they want? Because what we were hearing was not necessarily the same thing from every family. And for many of them, justice wasn't limited to, if it even included, putting an officer behind bars. They wanted something more when it came to how they feel like they should be cared for, how they should be made safe where they live, and how they were even seen as members of the community. There's something about these experiences that rob that of them. So any story that sort of brings them back into the community that they've been pushed out of is so important.
Yeah, definitely want to piggyback off of that. We even spoke with organizers on the ground who were explicitly naming, they're burned out and they've been doing the work, and a lot of that is, glossed over. And so on a micro level, we're each members of our neighborhood, our communities. How do we show up and support each other? Whether that's cooking a meal for someone, whether that's, what do you need in that moment? Whether that's somebody gifting somebody a book, but also believing people in their pain and what they're going through, because so much of the system at large tells them that it's not true. And something as much as validation and just continued support helps. And I think from a political standpoint, from an abolitionist perspective, it's really, really thinking about how to tilt systems and start to think about new systems and try to experiment and see how that works on a community level, and go beyond that, which is difficult work to do. And it doesn't happen overnight, but I think is necessary.
Yes, I agree, definitely. Thank you so much, Melissa. Thank you, Ingrid, for joining us today. Really
Thank you
appreciate
so
it.
much for having us.
Of course.
Thank you. We're so honored.
Take care.